So I've been sitting here in my shop just examining the layout, and I think I need to shake things up. The location of my miter saw has been the biggest issue in this space. Before I moved any tools in here, I thought that I was going to have my jointer and planer in the middle of the space, and I would put my miter saw on this wall over here. But then I got my jointer and planer, and I thought that it would be way too crowded in the middle of the space here. So for a short while, my miter saw lived right here, but it was really problematic when I was jointing long boards and when I actually wanted to use the miter saw. So I moved it to this wall over here, and this worked until I got my dust collector, and then it just felt a little bit too cramped in this area. So then I moved it to this wall over here. Not ideal, but I thought that this was it. I wasn't going to put the miter saw in the corner. I was going to put it more centered and have the cart on wheels to be able to move it out of the way from that wall in case I needed to chop long pieces. So today I was all set to build a brand spanking new miter saw station, and something just didn't feel right. So I've been sitting here just thinking, and I think I have to go with my original plan, where my miter saw is on the wall where my jointer currently is, and I'll have to move my jointer into the middle of the space next to my planer. And by doing this, I think I'll free up some space on this wall over here, and I'll be able to fit even more tools and add some more storage. So let's see if this will work out. First thing I gotta do is get the miter saw out of the way and start rearranging my other tools to see if this layout could actually work. Before committing to any positions, I made sure there was enough room for both the infeed and outfeed of my planer and jointer when working with long boards. I also had to be mindful of the outfeed space required for the table saw. The only issue I came across was the quick connect adapter on the dust collection for my planer. It was preventing me from getting the jointer as close to the planer as possible. So I 3D printed a new adapter that's lower profile and will connect with magnets. I've used these adapters on my other tools, and they're a game changer for sure. Now my jointer and planer are as close to each other as possible, and I can easily swap the dust collection from tool to tool. Now that that's settled, I cleared off those shelves and removed them. I always knew when I put those shelves up that they would just be temporary. They worked for a while, but what I have planned is going to be so much neater. Here's the plan. I'm going to build a rolling tool cart where my Bamboo Lab H2D printer will live, and I'll build some upper cabinets for lots of storage, and that will leave some room under the cabinets for something else. At this point, I'm not quite sure yet. Using SketchUp, I printed out a cut list for all my parts and laid it out directly on the plywood sheets. I took the time to clearly label each piece before moving on to the next step, which is breaking down these big sheets into smaller, more manageable parts. I'm going to work on the rolling tool cart first. I don't fully trust myself to get perfectly matching parts using just a track saw, and these pieces were too wide to cut the usual way of the table saw. So I decided to try something new with this new rip fence from SawStop. It has 3 different mounting positions, one of which turns it into an L fence. That setup let me line up a template right on my mark, and then I cut each piece to find a length by running the template along the L fence. This keeps everything really square and consistent. I think I'm probably going to utilize this technique more in the future. So this tool cart is designed to hold a 3D printer, but not just any 3D printer. The H2D is also a laser cutter, which means this can't just be a regular cart. Laser cutting, as you may be aware, creates a lot of smoke. So to keep things safe and clean in the shop, I designed the cart with a built-in shelf to hold a smoke purifier, so I can use it safely without my shop filling up with fumes. When designing this all in SketchUp, I just drew up the sizes that I needed. I didn't really plan out how it was all going to come together, so everything you're going to see moving forward is just me making decisions on the fly. And I decided to take it easy with pocket holes here. When it comes to shop projects, I want to get them done as quickly as possible so I can move on to what I actually like doing. So don't expect anything fancy in this video. I didn't even bother to edge band any of the plywood. I debated edge bending it all, but decided I'd rather spend my time hanging out with my kids. After getting the boards clamped in position, I easily screwed the sides to the bottom using pocket hole screws, then I clamped the top in place and screwed it to the sides. To finish up the main box, I added a 1/2-inch plywood back. This really helps stiffen up the whole cart. Next, I flipped it over and screwed the casters onto the bottom. With the frame complete, I'm ready to move on to building the drawers. I'm using 1/2-inch plywood for the draws, which I ripped to height on the table saw, then cut to length at the miter saw. Learning from my past mistakes, I label all the parts to keep everything organized and avoid confusion. Next, I cut a 1/4-inch groove on all the pieces to hold a 1/4-inch plywood bottom, and these draws are ready for assembly. Sticking with the KISS method for this shop project, all the draw parts will just wrap around the plywood bottom. Then they're held together with a small little bit of glue and a few brad nails. Like I said earlier, nothing fancy. It's a shop draw, not an heirloom piece, but I think it'll be strong enough to survive my usual level of shop abuse, so we're good. It's way easier to install the draws with the cart at eye level, so up it goes on the workbench, and I start with the bottom draw and work my way up. To install the slides, I place spacers underneath them to get them at the right height, and then set the draw on those same spacers to attach it to the slides. For the next draw, I stack more spacers on top of the one that I just installed and repeat the whole process until I get to the top. The height of each spacer comes straight from my SketchUp drawing. I designed each draw to be a specific size and height, so I just followed the plan, and for once that plan actually worked out. But one thing I totally overlooked when designing this corner was the plug for my planer. It ended up being right in the way, so I swapped it out for a lower profile plug that sits more flush with the wall, and I could move on to installing the draw faces. Another slight problem here, the draw faces are 1/2 inch and so are the draw parts. I only had 1-inch long cabinet screws, which would poke through the fronts, and I ran out of washers. Well, in less than 20 minutes, quicker than I could make a supply run, I had 3D printed washers, so now I can move on with installing the faces. Using 1/8-inch spacers that I also 3D printed, I placed the draw fronts in position, then locked them in place with those screws and 3D printed washers through the pre-drilled holes. Before installing the next draw, I screwed on the draw pull and worked my way up until I got to the top. The larger bottom draws are designed to hold rolls of filament. To keep those rolls organized, I printed these ledges on my X1C, which I keep in my office. Since the ledges were too big to print in one piece, I split them into 4 parts and added some simple joinery so they could quickly be glued together in the right positions. I could have easily made these out of wood as well, but the 3D printer works while I can work on something else. To get those ledges positioned just right in the draws, I used actual rolls of filament as a guide. And I only used double-sided tape to secure them, so I can easily tweak the layout later if I need to. Now you can see, when the draw is nearly empty, those rolls of filament stay in place even when I slam it shut. Awesome. All right, moving on to the upper cabinets. Using the cut list I made earlier, I broke the large panels down into rough chunks with the track saw. Then I split those in half with the table saw, which gives me one clean, straight edge. After that, I take each board and rip it to its final width using that good edge against the fence. And now I've got 2 clean, parallel edges. Next, those pieces get squared up and cut to final length. I square up one end at the miter saw, then flip the board around and cut it to final length on the opposite end using a stop block. After all those parts are cut, I could determine how large the back panel will be and cut that at the table saw. I decided to do things a little differently this time by using a 1/2-inch back instead of a 1/4-inch back. That thicker back panel will sit in a 1/4-inch groove in the cabinet sides, so I need to cut a 1/4-inch tongue on 2 of the edges. That's easily done with a single pass using my 6-in-1 jig. I have a 1/4-inch bit in there set to cut 1/4-inch deep. Then I place the fence so it's directly next to the edge of the bit, and this setup acts as a replacement to a rabbiting bit. Now to make the grooves with that same 1/4-inch bit, I make a second pass on all the insides of the cabinet sides that's spaced a 1/4-inch away from the edge using an edge guide. This was actually a last-minute decision to build the cabinets this way, so after making these grooves, I had to recut the top and bottom pieces of the cabinets so they were just as wide as the inside of those grooves I just cut in, which is the thickness of the 1/2-inch back. I think this will be more clear when I actually assemble it all. But before I could do that, I need to drill holes for the shelf pins. Every time I make a cabinet project, I make a new shelf pin jig on a scrap piece of MDF, and I keep losing it or tossing it. I don't know what happens to it. So as I'm editing this, I just looked up shelf pin jigs on MAKERWORLD and found a couple. I'll be sending one to the printer right after I'm done with this video. All right, time to assemble the cabinets. I start by placing one of the sides next to the bottom panel and making sure the front edges are flush. Then I tack them together with a few brad nails to hold everything in place and do the same thing on the other side. You can see here at the back, the bottom panel is actually set in about a ½ inch from the edge. That's to leave room for the back panel, which will sit in those grooves I cut earlier. Once that's all lined up, I flip the assembly over and tack the top panel into place too. Don't worry, all the brads are just temporary. They're basically acting like little clamps. Now I can go back, pre-drill and countersink some holes and lock everything together with screws to make the connections permanent. Now what really makes these cabinets rock solid though, the back panel. It slides right into the grooves cut out earlier, then it's locked into place to the top and bottom panel with screws through countersunk holes. This tongue and groove situation is probably the fanciest thing about this video, but I promise it's not that hard. Just size your back a ½ inch wider than the opening to accommodate both 1/4 inch tongues. I debated assembling these with pocket holes so you don't see the screws from the outside, but once again, shop project. The visible screws on the sides don't bother me here. All right, moving on to the doors. I measured the actual cabinet width and ripped them to size. I figured it'd be way easier to mount the door hardware while the cabinet was still on the bench before it went up on the wall. And yep, I was definitely right about that. I laid the cabinet on its side, lined up the door so the bottoms were flush, then marked about 4-ish inches from each end of the door and extended those lines across both parts. To drill the hardware holes, I used this overlaid door jig that, once again, I found on MAKERWORLD. I printed it out, lined it up, and used it as a guide to get all those hole locations just right. Then I screwed the hardware in place and repeated the same process on the other side. For the doors, I used this Kreg jig to drill out the holes for the hinge, then screwed them in place. So, I totally forgot to order door handles for these cabinets, but I ended up figuring out something way cooler instead. I designed this draw pull jig a while back that uses interchangeable inserts for different shaped integrated draw pulls, and I realized that I could use it to make hidden pulls in these cabinet doors. The jig is clamped in place using dovetail grooves on the underside. Then I use a bowl carving bit along the template to create this really cool hidden pull. Honestly, I love that I was able to find another use for this jig. It just makes me so happy. And the file's available on my website for anyone that's interested in printing it out themselves. All right, time to install the cabinets. According to my SketchUp plan, the cabinets needed to sit a specific distance from the wall to leave enough room for the 3D printer. So I marked that distance, then placed a story stick cut to the exact width of the cabinets. On that mark, I had already marked out the stud locations earlier when I installed the temporary shelves, so I just transferred those marks onto the story stick. Then I took the story stick to the back of the cabinet and transferred those stud locations down the length of the cabinet at pre-marked intervals. Now I can drill holes straight through the cabinet back on all those marks, and I repeat the process for the second cabinet. To easily hang them on the wall, I'll use a 2x4 ledge. I screwed it to place in the center through one stud, then got the ledge level and secured it through the rest of the studs. To make this next step easier, I got a second pair of hands. After resting the cabinet on the ledge, I nudged it over to the mark I made on the wall for where the cabinet needs to start and screwed it to the studs through the holes I drilled through the back earlier. After one screw was in place, I didn't really need him to hold on to the cabinet anymore, but he insisted. Then I repeated the process on the next cabinet. This right here is why I chose to go with the ½ inch back the way that I did. I was able to screw the cabinet directly into the studs along the entire length. In the past, I've used 3/4 inch plywood nailer strips with a 1/4 inch back to cover them, but in that setup, you're limited to driving screws through just those narrow 3-inch strips. This way I get full contact with the wall, a ton of fastening points, and yeah, maybe it's overkill, but this cabinet's not going anywhere. Plus, I gained an extra ½ inch of interior space inside the cabinet, which is always nice. While I still had some helping hands around, we clipped the doors on, and they look awful and completely uneven at this point, but about 10 minutes of making adjustments, then they look great. Now I can unscrew the 2x4 ledge and install the shelves. Before I can organize everything, there's one more step, the open shelf above the printer. So we brought the printer in, and I found this really cool AMS riser on MakerWorld that will enable me to lift the top glass if needed. This file uses 2 different colors, and since the H2D is a dual nozzle printer, it'll save me 254 grams of filament compared to a single nozzle setup. No need to purge filament between color swaps. 254 grams is basically like a whole fidget toy for my son. This print was also massive. It was done in 2 halves, but with the H2D's build volume of 350 by 320 by 325, both halves technically could have fit on the bed at the same time, but at the time I printed it, I just didn't have enough filament on hand. This sits on top of the printer, then the AMS sits on top of it. Now I can get a good height for the open shelf based on where the lid of the AMS ends up when opened. Now I can install the shelf using the old brackets and load it up with a ton of filament. This makes me so happy. And now another problem to solve. The fume extractor sits perfectly on that little ledge I built into the cart, but the exhaust hood that comes with the H2D shoots straight back, which would bump into the wall if I tried to push it all the way back. Luckily, someone else already solved this problem. I found the file on MakerWorld for a replacement 90-degree hood, and I could not get over how clean this PLA CF printed. It looks like a molded part. Anyway, I also printed a TPU gasket that was included in the file, then installed it to the back. The coolest part about this file is a quick connect adapter. It actually prints with an integrated TPU gasket right on it. Because the H2D has 2 independent nozzles, it can print multiple materials on one part. A single nozzle printer would not be able to pull this off, at least not in one print. Nice and tidy in the back, I can start loading up the drawers. Here I'll store all the build plates, accessories, and materials that I'll use with this printer. I think I could do better with those laser modules though. And of course, MakerWorld had the solution already. I printed these accessory holders and then swapped out to the laser to cut the rest of the file. This is why that AMS riser was necessary. It makes it so much easier to swap modules by removing the top glass. Then I could laser cut the custom cork inserts. The H2D is also a plotter, like for cutting vinyl templates, so it's really an all-in-one personal manufacturing hub that I am obsessed with. And if you want to check it out for yourself, check out the link in the description box below. The bottom 2 drawers are for holding filament. Each drawer can hold 24 rolls. So in total, this whole cart can hold a whopping total of 48 rolls of filament. That's pretty awesome. Onto the cabinets. I know this is getting a bit repetitive, but I found another awesome file on MakerWorld that's a great solution for holding spray cans, and it's fully customizable to hold different amounts of cans. Then I loaded up the cabinets with what I took off the initial temporary shelves, and I have so much more room left over to store even more things. I am so happy that I finally got this done. The H2D was sitting in my mudroom with all my kids' backpacks and shoes, and the filament was just all over the place. So yeah, this is nice. And I still have a ton more room in these cabinets. I didn't fill them up all the way, so this is really pretty awesome. And if you're wondering why I didn't build the cabinets all the way to the wall, it was so that I could walk by this little pathway here and not have to worry about hitting my head or my shoulder on something sharp like the corner of a cabinet. See, lots of space to walk here. Now, what am I gonna put under the cabinet? So as you can see here, I have plumbing, so I could potentially put a slop sink, which would be really great to have in the shop. But I'm thinking that I just created the perfect spot for a lathe. Anyway, the next part of the puzzle to figure out is the miter saw, because that temporary location is not working out for me. So I hope you guys enjoy this super simple, not fancy at all shop project, and I'll see you on the next one.